This episode contains specific and graphic information about a crime. Please be advised.
That passion and drive for something better is always going to be louder than the voice that tells me that I am a monster, or I don't have rights, or I don't deserve health care. Those voices will never be as loud as my need to do the right thing. And so I'm going to continue doing that.
Welcome to True Crime Prevention, the podcast that melds true crime with real solutions. Let's expose how all crime starts the same way, with a chance. Today, we won't give it a chance. I'm Paul DelPonte, and I work with McGruff the Crime Dog. Thank you for joining us. And we're really pleased to have as our guest today, Lennon Torres. Lennon, thank you for joining us, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Paul. I'm so excited to be here and honored to be in the same, virtual room as McGruff. I'm sure he's around there somewhere. So,
if we hear barking, we'll know he's around. But it's been one of my great pleasures to get to know Lennon a little bit. She's in her mid-20s and has done, so much crammed into so few short years. Some of it very inspiring and uplifting, and some of it tragic. And we're going to get into that. But why don't you start, just tell us a little bit about your background. I know you've got a fascinating beginning with dance moms and some other things, and life certainly has evolved quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think back to probably my very first love or passion in this life was definitely dance. I think that was probably the earliest thing that I grasped onto as a young person. And when I think back to my identity as a young person, dance has a lot to do with that. And that really was how I lived my life. Starting at 10 years old, I was training at, pretty much an Olympic level,
Wow.
30, 40 hours a week on top of full-time school. And that just meant that I was double majoring my whole life, is what I say, or I was, trying to do the academic thing and the arts thing simultaneously. And that really created quite the ambitious kid. And as a young kid, I really wanted to succeed. I wanted the attention. I wanted, all eyes on me, I guess you could say. And that really did happen when I was asked to be on Dance Moms and another show called Abby's Ultimate Dance Competition prior to that. And those two competition shows really cemented my place in the conversation of dance.
And around what age were you when you started appearing?
Yeah, I was 13 years old when
Wow.
Dance Moms, when I was on Dance Moms. And then I think I finished around 15 or 16.
Wow. Yeah, that is an early start.
Yeah, definitely an early start. I always joke with people that, I started my first career at 13. So, I've had a lot of different lives between now and then. And I really am thankful that I've gotten to live so much life at 26. If I wasn't 26, I would think you were trying to call me old, Paul, by telling me I've experienced so much. But I'll trust that you mean that I'm just so young,
26. Exactly. Crazy. Right now you're entering those years where is thinking you're older or younger, good or bad.
Yeah.
But anyway, we are going to unpack a lot today. We're going to get into a range of topics, online grooming, cyberbullying, how real life impacts that, some of the dark side of some of the TV stuff you've been on, and then not least of which, LGBTQ hate, because unfortunately, there was too much of it. But before we get into that, you'll notice my mug, and one of my colleagues is going to tell you how you can get that and some other merchandise.
This episode is brought to you by me, McGruff the Crime Dog, America's favorite crime-preventing canine. Check out the brand new True Crime Prevention mug by visiting the McGruff shop. It's perfect for sipping morning coffee while listening to a new episode or preventing crime in your community. 100% of the profits support crime prevention programs. Shop the mug and much more, like t-shirts, hats, or toy cars at mcgruff.org. Use code TRUECRIMEPREVENTION for 25% off. Let's take a bite out of crime together.
Thanks and welcome back. While you're busy shopping, don't forget to hit like and subscribe because we have important stories to share. They're stories that have some negativity to them, but always hopefulness, because there are great people out there like Lennon who've been able to overcome adversity, horrific crimes, horrific torment, and dedicating themselves to help others. So why don't we start with some of the TV stuff and how you got into that and how some of the darker side of that started popping up in your life?
Yeah, being on a TV show at a young age is really interesting. I think it calls on young people to, grow up a lot faster. We have to think through a lot of things that a lot of kids don't have to think about, how we're being perceived, what it means to, have a job and make money and have a paycheck that you and your family are expecting. And so I think being a young person on TV was just another, experience. It was a job. It was something that really did speed along my growth to adulthood. But at the same time, I often talk about the fact that being on a show like that, being in an environment like that, really caused me to push pause on a lot of conversations that I needed to have with myself, whether it be about my gender identity as a trans woman or at the time, whether it be just the fact that I was really struggling with anxiety. I was not given really the space to make those observations and come up with a path forward because I was working, I was busy, I was moving, I was going, and they were during the most formative times of my career, which is something that I really don't take lightly. Those years as a teenager are very formative, and they form a lot of the ways that you approach and move through the world as an adult. And I think that's part of why I have really, been just now kind of coming to terms with it, of what that has meant for me as an individual and what that means for my future.
Among the things that you encountered were things that, I guess, if you look at some previous child actors, stars over the years, it's not a new thing. Predates the internet. But then the internet and social media came into play quite a bit in what you were going through. A lot of times, I like to say what's happening with the speed in which people can communicate through social media platforms in other ways has almost created sort of an accelerating format or ecosystem around some of the darker sides of things. Would you say that sort of makes sense?
I mean, absolutely. I have been a huge sort of believer that our online communities in our online world are just an extension of our in-person world and what we experience day to day, but with a supercharger on them. So as somebody who started, crafting a public image at 13, I remember Instagram was coming out. It was at that same exact time. It was, Instagram was coming out and, people started having it. And I remember I got my very first Instagram account when I was in seventh grade. And in seventh grade, I was a much different person than I am now. I did not have the sort of knowledge that I have now. And so it was a playground for good and bad. So as a young user on Instagram, I remember I went from like under 100 followers when I was 13 years old to over 100,000 in what felt like an overnight, situation. And back then, I mean, I can't verify for sure, but I imagine there were much less safety features and safety tools for young people on these platforms 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And so that really paints a picture for me that, if I'm nervous about kids being on social media now, what sorts of things was I experiencing at that age when there weren't even the safeguards that do exist today, which I think are minimal, but they're there. And back then they weren't. And so I had a flurry of inappropriate contact from adults, really hateful, targeted cyberbullying, death threats, and being 13 on these social media platforms as they were gaining popularity and sort of cementing themselves in our everyday lives was basically a way that I was exposed to so much that a kid or a young person at the age of 13 should not be exposed to. The safeguards that exist now, which I think are minimal and abysmal, didn't even exist back then. And so that's something that I really think we should think about when we develop the future of social media.
You know, you raise a good point, because a lot of times we think of social media and we think of it in the immediate. But before you were on Instagram, back in the mid 1990s, McGruff was the first one who started warning people about cyberbullying. And I know our good colleagues at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children started talking about things like social grooming and things online back around that same time. So people were getting the warning bells, and now here we are some 20 plus years later, and not a whole lot has changed. So thank you for bringing up that point that we're talking about something that's happening relatively quickly, but at the same time, a lot of time is passing without people really taking serious action. Go into a little bit more about what were some of the early things you started encountering, and how serious were they? And how serious did you think they were at age 13, 14?
Such a great question. I first just have to say too, right at the beginning, you know, the lack of movement is just appalling. Like to say, like, you know, McGruff was talking about cyberbullying in the 90s, and we have incredible allies like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children who talked about the dangers of online grooming, you know, way back before it was as prominent and a part of dominant culture. And that is really because of the lack of regulation and accountability at the big tech level. And that is sort of what I've spent most of my career fighting against. And during my career, that's when I was realizing much of what I had experienced was harm, and that I too was actually a survivor of online harms and online grooming and attempted sextortion, because through my job and through my work at Heat Initiative, it was part of my day-to-day to hear and listen and take guidance from those that were impacted. And as I built those relationships, and as I truly listened to the stories and the livelihoods that were impacted by this harm, through that work was how I realized I myself had experienced it too. And so it was a really weird moment for me, because to your point, when I was a young person, I thought this was normal. Like I had conditioned myself to think that these experiences were just kind of part of the norm. And one of the biggest atrocities in that was that as a young person, I had already caught on to the fact that my followers, my audience of over 100,000 people, were more interested in seeing more of my body than they were of my dancing. And to think that as a 13, 14-year-old teenager, I had already associated more likes, more comments, more engagement on these platforms, specifically Instagram, with being more naked or sexualizing myself as a minor. When I would do those things, the likes would shoot up, the comments would shoot up, the amount of people that would send it places would shoot up. And what that allowed for was a more impressive insight summary and a more impressive analytics package to send to brands to tell them that I am worth their whatever amount of money to post about their brand on my Instagram. And so that shift and that sort of brain like function and that sort of way of thinking, in my mind, is really, really harmful, because we are basically teaching young kids that they can make money and receive a dopamine hit, a dopamine high, more so if they take their clothes off. And that is something that I think has to do with the incentive structure of social media. It's always going back to engagement. It doesn't matter what the content is, as long as it's making people stay on the platform, as long as it's incentivizing time spent over how they're feeling or what the impact of that video actually is. And so when you have that incentive, every feature, every change you make to the platform is going to underscore that incentive. And so that's why I believe we're in this position today where, unfortunately, there are hundreds, probably more, that we don't even know of, kids that don't get to sit in the chair that I sit in today and talk to you, Paul, because they've lost their lives. And for them, exploration or taking risk was met with death versus met with a consequence or a safeguard or, a skid on the knee when you like do something crazy on your bike. Like, this is just it's become the most prolific killer of kids of our time. Honestly, it's really terrifying to see.
You talked about the lack of safeguards, and what you said just made me think, back when I was growing up, before the internet, kids always faced dangers. You had to be careful how you walked home from school and all those kinds of things. You were taught those things. And you were also taught, well, if you're ever in serious trouble, look for a police officer, look for someone in authority. At age 13, when you were online encountering all these things, and even beyond 13, the safety guards aren't apparent. They're not there. It's not like, gee, I'm gonna call the police, or I'm gonna run up the street and find a police officer and say, hey, that strange person following me looks suspicious. If these online platforms want to say they mirror real life, and to some extent they do, and other extent they don't, but one area where they don't are the safety features. And, there are not police officers there. And, we've been in the habit of celebrating safe communities. When a community does something where they participate in events and other things that make that whole community safer, they should be rewarded and commended. But it doesn't seem like the social media platforms are taking those steps. And, it's what you're talking about. There are probably some simple things they could do, it sounds like.
I mean, Paul, that is the name of the game. There is so much that they could do that they're not doing. And I think the way I want to answer that is really thinking about where we've seen this before. Where have we seen industry move too fast, break things, harm people, and have to sort of take a step back and set up guardrails to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore? The things that I'm sort of hinting at are big tobacco and the climate industry. We've seen so much activism and fight back of these big oil or big tobacco companies because they were marketing unsafe products to young kids, big tobacco that is, and basically addicting an entire generation so that they had lifelong customers. And what works when going after a David and Goliath is continuing to pressure these corporations and make it bad business to harm kids or addict kids or do a bad thing in the climate space. It's bad business to, tear down a rainforest, like making it bad business. And so when people ask me, do you think you can do it? Are we going to get into a world where, we rein in big tech? And I say, of course, because we're not going to stop trying. And every industry and every example leading up to this point has been regulating a big industry. And I just think that big tech right now isn't being regulated because it's moving so fast. People don't know, they don't understand it, and they have all the resources in the world to make sure that we don't regulate them. And so I think it's just something that we really have to stay honest about, with the fact that, social media and big tech need to have those same guardrails that we put up for climate and we put up for big tobacco, not because we don't see a world where technology is part of it and tech is used as a tool, but we see a world where our tech is not embedded in our day-to-day lives, something we're addicted to and something that we can't put down. I always joke with people my age that we've made tech the main character. Like, stop making tech the main character. Like, they're supposed to be a tool. Tech is a tool. They're not the driver. It's the tool.
Absolutely. And, you talked about the tobacco industry. And one of the real things that early on, relatively speaking, early on, and we are talking something that goes back to before the United States were the United States, when we were still colonies, and was a lot of the economic incentive for colonization. But beyond that, more recently, relatively, the public got more involved because increasingly the public was getting fed up with some of the things that bothered them. If you look back to when the smoking in public places laws started taking effect, they were not effective because there was a police officer in the corner of a restaurant or a movie theater stopping you from lighting up. They were effective because the people at the next table or the next row would turn around and say, hey, put that out. You can't do that here anymore. It was a law that empowered people to say, don't do that. And I think part of that goes to where the public mind is in acceptance. And let me ask you, so one of the things that I've seen, I'd be curious your take on this, is on one hand, you ask somebody, are you aware of harms on social media, Instagram, Snapchat, and have you heard about all those things? Yes. And then at the same time, they'll then pick up their phone and get on one of those platforms as if that conversation didn't happen. Do you see a disconnect between people's awareness of the harm and what they do minute by minute, day to day?
Yes. And I think the discrepancy is because I've seen it with people in my own family when I talk about the work that I do every day who have young kids. They almost want to separate themselves from the problem because it can't be their kid. It can't be me. I don't think that I'm affected by it, or, it's this lack of ability to see yourself in it. And I think that as long as you're feeding the beast and as long as you're part of the system, you're going to have a really hard time understanding the harm that system is causing you. And I mean that from first person experience. I have, Paul, I just listed out a bunch of crappy things I experienced on social media. I didn't delete Instagram until I was 25. It took a long time for me to sort of realize that I was a part of this, exploitation machine before I could even step out of it. And I think too, working with so many incredible, brave parents who have experienced the worst of the worst and the loss of their children, what I hear from them is that they're still getting, well, that wouldn't be my kid. And then it becomes the parents' fault. And, I think about parents who I know, Amy Neville, who was, just on this podcast. Those are some of the best parents I've ever met in my life. This is not something that's happening to one kid, two kids. This is happening at scale. And I think that people don't know how to accept that because this technology and these companies have embedded themselves into every aspect and fabric of our being. So the thought of it not being that is so terrifying because it's almost unimaginable. There are a generation of adults now that don't remember a time they didn't have social media.
Right.
That's concerning.
It is. And part of it, and you mentioned taking so long to quit Instagram. Your analogy, again, I think was dead on because somebody who was addicted to nicotine often took years and many failed attempts before they could quit smoking because of the same factors. And we've had multiple Surgeon General reports warning about the addictive nature, just what you described. They have those likes, and the more you get them, you get that little boost in your brain, and your endorphins go off, and you want more. And it's part of human nature, but yet there is this outside engineer who's figuring out, well, I can make money off this. So let me ask an interesting question. If Mark Zuckerberg invited you to sit down and have lunch with him, what would you tell him? I see the smirk on your face too.
I mean, what a crazy question, Paul. I think I would tell him I won't stop until he steps down. I have no hope that anything I say to him will change his mind. He knows the harm that his platforms are causing the kids that it's killing and refuses to do anything. He has more power than our elected officials and runs, frankly, the way that most people in America consume their news and media. And I've lost all hope in him because he stood up and turned around in the big tech hearing last year in 2023, 2024, and looked at all the parents who've lost kids and apologized, sat down, and did absolutely nothing after that to protect any other kids. And that's when I knew that this wasn't a game of morality for him. It's a game of takedown, and it's people like me that won't stop. So if I was invited to have lunch with him, I would show up because I'm a good sport, and I'd sit down and I would say, I'm not wasting my breath on you. I'm just going to tell you that, I will have a job until you don't. So
There you go. And to let you know that you shouldn't feel alone in that space, I had a recent conversation with an attorney general of a fairly large state who expressed how, oh, well, I'm probably not the one who should reach out to them because I don't think social media companies like me very much right now. And my response was, "Oh, don't feel alone. I'm sure I'm not getting invited to any of their Christmas parties either." But so you're in good company. I want to get into, before we run out of too much time, the issues around hate and what you've experienced and what that means, and sort of unpacking some of that. Can you give us some specific examples of how you were targeted around hateful speech, hateful actions, as you started identifying or people became aware of your own sexual identity?
yeah, so I was forced to have this conversation way before I wanted to have this conversation, to be honest. I was 13 and on a television show, and they saw an opportunity to push narratives onto me as a young person. And, at the time I was a young boy and I was dancing with a lot of young girls. And so they really pushed a narrative of me either liking the girls or the girls liking me. And what that did was it forced me to have a conversation with myself, because I realized in that moment, no, I had not had that feeling, that yearn at all in my life. And then all of a sudden it was like primary plot point on a reality television show. And so that forced me to start asking myself questions about my own identity. And what I realized was that I did not like girls and that I was attracted to boys. And that was pretty evident in the way that I presented myself. I mean, in the end, I'm a girl and I'm a trans woman. And so as a young person, I was presenting very feminine. And because of that narrative on TV and the way that I was perceived by the public, I was called gay over and over again. I don't buy it. Like, he's lying, or she's his beard, like things like that. And I'm like, having this happen in my comment section on Instagram when I was 13 years old and hadn't even come to terms with it myself. Back when my Instagram was around, I would sometimes
You probably hadn't dated much, if not at all.
No, not even
Right.
not at all. That was not on my radar. And so it's just crazy to me. But that was really when it started, was it became pop culture. And, there's still to this day really inappropriate fan fiction of like me and like the other girls on the show. And it's just, putting that narrative out there only perpetuated conversations that I wasn't ready to have. And
Right.
producers saw that as a way to exploit and get more viewers.
Right. When we talk about hate, it takes different shapes and forms, but when you look at the root of it, there's a certain commonality, whether it's anti-Semitism, anti-trans, anti Arabic, any racism, whatever, it is a dehumanizing factor. It is, instead of getting to know you as Lennon, they want to get to label you as something else. So how did it start? You mentioned comments on Instagram. At any point, did it cross over from online into real life?
Yeah, that's funny. I actually don't know if I've ever told this story publicly. But when I was in, I think I was 20, probably when I was 20 or 19 or 20, I was, in the middle of my gender transformation. I had sort of opened the idea that I might be non-binary and was, sort of exploring what it meant to exist outside of a binary. And that was my journey to experiencing and realizing I was trans and that I wanted to transition and that I am, in fact, a woman. And through that middle period, I often don't talk a lot about because that was when I was, the most vulnerable publicly. It was, right after the first Trump administration. It was in a conservative state. My hometown is Arizona. It's pretty conservative. And I would, go out with friends and, go and whatever. And I went to this bar and I was like catcalled really bad names. And I remember I went straight to the bathroom to like hide in there with my friend, and she was so mad. And I just remember her really wanting to like go after the man who like called me the F slur and like wanted to like punch him in the face. And I just told her, I was like, one, this is about me, not you. Two, he could have a gun. And three, we got to stay safe. And that's just not the battle we're going to fight. And we left the bathroom, and fortunately I had like my basically second dad there. His name is Mike, and he was able to sort of be a barrier between the guy and us, but he kept going, kept coming at us, and it got to the point where it almost got violent. And I just remember getting in the guy's face because all of the people around me wanted to help and protect me, but I was like, this is not about you guys, this is about me, so I need to take it. And I remember standing up and just giving him a piece of my mind. That's probably not appropriate for this podcast, but it's like I'll never remember, like that was just such a moment because I remember surrendering my safety because I knew that in that moment my voice was more important to me than my life. And so I like remember in that moment when it had escalated to the point of like people I love maybe being in danger, like everything went out the window. And I was like, I'm so done. And that was just one of the most profound moments of hate that I've ever seen because this man, maybe going through his own crap, felt the need to go after a young 19, 20-year-old. Like,
and he just obviously saw you and just
yeah,
didn't know you, correct?
yeah,
Right.
did not know me, just
Right.
saw me. And I think that that sort of behavior is only celebrated and perpetuated by a lot of the hate we see online. These people feel like they are invincible. Their hateful posts aren't taken down, or their hateful posts are written off as free speech. When in reality, it's really dangerous and only perpetuates more violence. And although I'm in a much different place now, I have a lot more privilege now. I'm, relatively cis passing. I'm white passing. I'm, through the middle parts of my transition. Like that's the thing that I tell people is like, I'm sitting in a seat of privilege now, but all the hate that's happening online is also happening in real life. And if not, it's just perpetuating it.
Let's talk about this free speech issue, because that's something I know as we'll start getting viewer comments on this episode, people are going to start raising that. So I want to talk about that for a minute. So hate crimes have been illegal in the US for about 2 decades, and in many states long before that. And what happened to you, people will say, well, that wasn't a crime. He was he as much as you don't like it, we have free speech in this country. But you have to remember, and I'm speaking from the perspective of the National Crime Prevention Council, keyword prevention, you have to look at what builds up to a crime. we don't allow, we have very limited restrictions on firearms in the US. And that's a contentious issue with a lot of people. But one area where there is universal agreement, we don't allow people who've been convicted of domestic abuse to own a firearm. There are just some things that make practical sense. And just to put your mind at ease, you actually followed some pretty good advice, because what McGruff says about bullies, and it's a good thing you had some good friends and allies around to keep you safe, because you never want to do anything to get yourself physically hurt or harmed. But you treat a bully either in person or online the same way. Stand up, and you stood up. Say something. Sure sounds like you said something, and you gave him an earful, and then you walk away. You get yourself out of that situation. But if you let bullying go totally unchecked, you enable the bullier to bully again. And I think that's part of the reality of it. But if we go into hate, and you raised a very good topic or point that you hadn't seen this guy ever before, and he just took it upon himself, and you said it was getting close to becoming violent. And it is at that point, depending on what judge you may have on any given day in a courtroom, whether that becomes free speech or that it becomes an act of violence. And you're getting very close to it. And from a crime prevention standpoint, you want to have a certain distance from getting close to that line of breaking the law. And it doesn't matter whether the crime is hate, whether the crime is murder, whether the crime is selling drugs. Preventing the crime, whatever the crime, all calls for the same method of you've got to stop it well in advance. I mean, that's how we're really going to reduce crime rates. And the hate crime rate over the last several years has had an upward trend, while murder and theft and other things have had a downward trend. And I think you'd have to be sleeping under a rock not to realize that everywhere you turn, there's hateful speech. Doesn't matter if you're gay, Jewish, or whatever, you are at risk. How have you started having experienced that? And now you've moved on, and you're taking on more of a formal role as an advocate. But personally, how have you sort of balanced that? You're at risk. You feel you're less at risk now than you were then, both because of where you are in life, as well as I think probably a lot of skill building that grew out of necessity more than anything else. But how do you balance that now, going out in public and being fearful or not being fearful?
Yeah, I mean, to be so frank, some days it's easier than others. I live in Los Angeles, so I feel really safe and supported by my community. I think if I didn't live in a city like Los Angeles, it would be very different. 6 months ago, when I was, back home in Arizona for some extended amount of time, I felt much different. Just it really sucks. I think like some days are better than others. I think I would be lying if I said I woke up every day and was like, we're going to fight the fight and it's going to be great, because honestly, some days I wake up, look at the news, have a pit in my stomach, and go back to bed, and just like I can't deal with it, because it really is exhausting, and hate is so draining. But I've had a lot of practice, and I think that's how I've continued to do what I do. And the sort of driving force of my advocacy and my career is standing up to bullies and to take back power for the people and to protect our most vulnerable. And I will keep doing that. And that focus and that passion and drive for something better is always going to be louder than the voice that tells me that I am a monster, or I don't have rights, or I don't deserve health care. Those voices will never be as loud as my need to do the right thing. And so I'm going to continue doing that. And I encourage everyone to lead with love, because even the strongest of us are very fragile.
Absolutely. And for those who are listening and are getting to write something in the comments about, oh, you're veering off topic, this isn't about crime, let me give you this to think about. It's about stopping a crime. And if you don't stop hate early on, it leads to crime. It leads to somebody getting seriously injured or even worse. And so that's why we're talking about it. We talked about getting to know the person, and, we're getting close to our time here. But even in just this short period of time, you've gotten to know Lennon. And you can see why, okay, maybe Lennon said some things I disagree with. Maybe we have differences on healthcare policy and all that. And that really is the First Amendment. It's okay to have those disagreements. It makes the debate healthier. And I don't think anybody could have sat there for our session so far and walk away from this episode in thinking anything else, but I really liked Lennon. Keep being a role model. I think it's important. We're pleased to have the HEAT initiative as sort of a new ally in this space, and your work with them is going a long way. And again, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Lennon, any last thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I'd say educate yourself and others of the crimes happening from what you probably sleep with under your pillow. Your phone and your digital communities are ripe with crime, unfortunately. And so spread the word and keep your communities safe. And yeah, just stay safe out there. And while you're staying safe, we're fighting the good fight. So plug in where you want.
Well, thank you for being there on side by side in that fight, and for really being an inspiration. So I thank you. I thank everyone for tuning in, and you can download your next episode next week. We'll be here every week. And on behalf of the National Crime Prevention Council, I'm McGruff the Crime Dog. Thank you, Lennon, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
That's an easy way to take a bite out of crime.